3. The Mandala Sands. A librarian dropped a stack of books on the table, puffing a breath as she relieved herself of the burden. "Lady Mairynne, Lady Nadia, these are the annals from the Third Age, as you requested." Looking up from my current read to see 6 new leather-bound tomes with the respective emperor's names scripted on the spines further sucked at my optimism and determination to find a way out of taking over the Serpentine Throne. "Thank you," I said, not feeling in the least bit grateful. I sighed and slammed the current book closed, reaching for the next. Kogo's engine has no solutions for me. Every decision she recorded seems to be in favor of increasing the ruler's class's power over the castes, the casteless, and the small folk. Why are our people so obsessed with all this hierarchy? The notion disgusted me and degraded my mother's work to unite all Nantai people. My aunt offered no reply to my obviously rhetorical and plaintive question. With arms folded, I leaned onto the tome and appraised my aunt across the table. I might endure for many moons and seasons before I could do justice to the task. Maybe such a notion, along with grief, clouded my thoughts. "Do you think I have lost my mind? Is all this worth the effort?" She rolled up the scroll she was reading and set it aside. The look on her face said she was preparing to provide me with an appropriate and decorous answer. "What you are doing, my dear niece, is wise. Even if you do not find what you seek, all the history you'll have learned will be of great value to you as the Nantai Empress." The leather covering of the book felt smoothly worn under my thumb as I idly traced inlaid circular designs. "Nadia?" She inclined her head and made a small sound. "Did you hear anything out of the ordinary? A terrorizing squall?" "I did." She smiled and drew her brows to a peak. "Muffled, though, within my cottage. Likely one of the mountain birds of prey coming farther south than normal. I'm sure it's nothing to worry over." I twisted my lips and chewed the inside of my cheek. It seemed an easy and logical answer, though I couldn't recall having heard that horrid of a noise from any bird. Although I hadn't much worldly experience either, having been so sheltered inside Storm's Keep at Arashi. Perceptively, she asked, "There is more that troubles you?" And in her regard, I could see my mother. It had been so hard to look upon my aunt, and wrongly, I still struggled with how much she reminded me of the one I lost. "I owe you an apology." "Why ever for?" She reached across the table, placing a hand on mine. I couldn't look her in the eye as I answered. "I pushed you away upon my mother's death." My aunt's soft laughter drew my confused attention. She reached for a goblet and drank. "If you owe me an apology for that, I owe myself one as well. For the first 10 days of mourning, I draped a sheet over every mirror in my cottage. Looking upon my own face felt like looking at New Orleans, and I couldn't handle the sight." "Would you tell me about her?" I asked. "Something new to me. I just want to feel close again for a few moments." Nadia squirmed in her chair, but at last she said, "I'll tell you a story of both your mother and your father. Much of it also involves your oldest sister. It is one that holds many emotions: happiness, sadness, worry, loss. It embodies who Noraline was as a person, how strongly she believed in the people, and how much she was willing to risk. Yet it warns of dangers throughout our land." She looked around the library. "As we are the only ones here, I'll trust you with this. But your sisters, especially Karine, mustn't know what I'm about to share. I only know your mother's side of the story, but I'm certain Karine has her own version." I agreed, hungry for the information, another story. Grasping my goblet, I filled it from the pitcher and drank deeply while she gathered her thoughts. She began, At the time, Careen was the only daughter of Tenyo Azarine and Kogo Norlin, and a prized jewel of the Nantai people. To the people, she meant that the emperor had an heir and the Serpentine Throne would no longer be at risk. To my sister and her husband, she represented only their love. Careen learned her words early and spoke in clear, though simple sentences from the very beginning. She learned her letters and to gather the storm's magic long before other children her age, albeit only in small doses. As it turns out, you all did. You, dear Mairynne, may have been the slowest to learn these basics, but you were still ahead of your peers. Nadia offered a demure smile, then continued. Tenyo Azarine and Kogo Norlin took ruling the people seriously. Your father held that the people, all people, big and small, were his reason for being. He rued when conflict arose between the castes and hated that the frost fighters and fire forgers were always positioning for rank within the people. Your mother, on the other hand, turned her attention to the small folk. Together, they believed that since Careen would one day rule the Nantai, she should take part in their diplomatic interactions with the people. I clung to every word about a life so different from what I knew at Storm's Keep. Father had never permitted my sisters or me beyond the bordering walls, so to learn that this may have not always been the case both startled and thrilled me. Nadia shifted, leaning back in her chair. When Careen was little more than 7, Norlin took her along as she traveled to hold an audience with King Esau of the small folk at Brenmore. Upon their arrival, the armies of the emperor ambushed them at the gates. The guards took Careen into custody on the orders of King Esau himself. Fearful of Norlin's magic, he held Careen hostage under the threat of slitting her young throat at the first signs of storms on the horizon. Why would Esau do such a thing? Didn't he know my mother's intent? Nadia lifted a shoulder. Clearly, Esau's reasoning never made it to her ears. Dismayed, I mumbled, "And why would I never have known of this story?" A touch ruefully, Nadia smiled. The time that followed tested your mother and father's very beliefs on how to rule the people. It strained their relationship, and it took time to recover. Your father decreed that no one speak of the story. When you read his annals, you will see a line stating, "The story of Norlin, Careen, and King Esau shall not be written and shall not be voiced, lest the teller spend the remainder of their days confined to the high tower." Until now, I have not shared what Norlin confided in me. But, as you are about to ascend, I believe it is your right to know. Taking a deep breath and trying to understand my father's motives, I motioned for her to continue. Her eyes turned glassy as she went on. Your mother spent more than 10 days negotiating with King Esau. For the entire time, she used her storm magic to hold the clouds away from Brenmore. The small king's ignorance as to the nature of our magic also kept him ignorant of the fact that she used her magic in this manner to protect her only daughter. In the end, Esau agreed to call off his guards and release the princess, and in exchange, Norlin agreed to lessen the taxes imposed by Azarine's father. Some considered this act by your mother treason, and in addition to Azarine's anger, it put stress upon him from his advisors. The whole situation became the seed of disagreement between your mother and father. Although, in time, Azarine came to see she was right, and wrote the decree, owning it as his own. That is their story, though. The small folk guards returned Careen to the empress in a sad state. To this day, we do not know what evil she experienced, but she'd lost enough weight that her eyes appeared sunken and bruised. Do you know of the rumors about the small folk? I tried to remember anything I'd read or heard, But I hadn't had a childhood like others, where the younglings learned much of the comings and goings around Nantai through rumors on the streets. Father had sequestered me within Storm's Keep. I had learned from the clergy, family, and tutors. Most play had been with my sisters, and my non-royal friends were chosen for me, much like Jessa or the occasional youngling of a caste noble, and we only associated under the supervision of a caretaker. With rumors being impolite in society, even younglings knew to avoid them when supervised. I shook my head. I suppose not. Well, there are tales that the small folk who inhabit Brenmore and the city of Umbra within the Evernight marshes feed on sorcery. If Carin's brief time with them is any proof, mayhap the rumor is true. For the 2 seasons that followed, Carin would speak to no one. I don't think she or your mother ever fully recovered. And after this, your father decreed that his children would not attend diplomatic missions until they had gained their majority and decided for themselves to attend. Nadia drained her glass. After hearing the story, I felt heavier than I had before, but for different reasons. My mother and father recovered from their disagreement, though. They always seemed to be happily in love. Oh, yes. Her eyes lit up. It must have been 5 or 6 years later, but they grew closer than they had been before. Within the next 4 years, Yasmin and you were both born, bringing more joy to them and the realm. I heard my name. Yasmin's sing-song voice broke into our conversation. We both startled and looked up to my sister, who stood beside the pile of annals. Delightful day, little sis. You're deep into the books, I see, she sang, wrinkling her nose. She leaned in to give our aunt a kiss on the cheek. Aunt Nadia, how are you? After the pleasantries, she pulled a chair to my side. I wanted to inform you of the plans for your ascension. Speechless, I raised my brows, exchanging a look of sheer surprise with Nadia. This proactivity was especially unlike her. Yasmin continued. I sent word to the Cloud Courtiers and received a prompt reply. The Sky Island will arrive the day after the last rites of mourning. Once the nymphs have gained their wings, we visit the Sky Island and attend the official High Cloud Court to discuss the plans. My stomach clenched. Against my hopes that this would drag out under my sister's usual dalliance, it appeared we'd be moving rather quickly through the formalities. I'd never been to the High Cloud Court before, a place that wasn't really a place, but castle grounds nestled upon a cloud in the sky. They traveled over Nantai constantly, given to the magic of the Cloud Courtiers who kept the floating grounds aloft. It enabled the castles to make lengthy journeys, retrieving nobles from all corners of Nantai to convene in the High Cloud Court. I hadn't gained my majority the last time Father attended. Distantly, I asked, "What is it like in the Cloud Court?" "Oh, Mairynne!" Yasmin leaned forward, light twinkling in her eyes. "The regalia is so elegant it makes me tremble." Naturally, the ceremonial attire and objects would be the first things to enter my sister's mind. She thought about things thinly, only reaching as far as the surface and relishing in things she could see. The tendency bothered me a little because she possessed the purest of souls beneath. I chuckled, knowing that I should be more specific when it came to such matters. "I'm wondering more about the proceedings." "Well, remember how the meeting you requested 2 days ago progressed?" Certainly, it hadn't gone in the ways I'd hoped, but I answered simply, "I do." "That is a mere sample of the ceremonial grandeur that transpires at the High Cloud Court. It should be an adventure. Nestrine and I plan to observe the proceedings of Comtesse Sansary's court whilst we are there." She put out her lower lip, then added, "Father wouldn't allow me into Love's court the last time we visited the Cloud Courtiers." Nadia and I exchanged another look. Clearly, my dear sister had ulterior motives for so aggressively pursuing the plans on my behalf. At the far end of the library, the door flew open, commotion reverberating into the room and shattering the quiet. The librarian scurried from behind the desk and disappeared through the door. The noise intensified, furious footsteps shuffling through the stone corridor outside. I settled my gaze on Nadia, perplexed. She shook her head and pressed a hand onto the table, lifting herself from the chair. Yasmin looked from me to my aunt in terrorized confusion, too. I stood and hurried to the door. Outside the library, guards were rushing past by the dozens. I reached out and grasped one at the elbow, and he turned to look at me, belatedly lowering his head when he realized my station. "What is your name?" I asked. "Mairynne, my lady," he answered, waiting for me to release my grip. "What is happening? Why has the city guard come to Stormskeep?" I demanded. "Lady Evangale, there has been a body discovered. If you are safe in the library, I urge you to return to your activities." Aghast that he'd insinuate I'd turn away from such a thing, I snapped. "Nonsense, Mairynne. Where is this body?" The librarian ducked her head and slunk back into the safety of the book and scroll-lined room. Mairynne stammered. I gripped his arm tighter. "It is clear that we don't have all day, Mairynne." Furthermore, my heart raced at the possibilities. I thanked the Holy Triad that Yasmin and Nadia were with me, rather than somewhere else. But after Mother's and Father's fates, what of Karine? Of my first guard, Thalaja? "I asked you where. I expect an answer." "Your chambers, Lady Evangale." His voice choked on the words. My stomach lurched. "Do you know who? Where is Gensui Thalaja Northerngull?" I couldn't stifle the latter question. He shook his head and fidgeted with his leather cuffs. "They didn't say, but it is good to see you standing here alive and well." "Well, let us not stand here any longer." I fell in with the soldiers moving toward my rooms. Thankfully, the corridor was open to the elements. I reached my hand out, closed my eyes briefly, and called for the wind. The gust at our backs moved everyone along faster. I hadn't taken time to see if Yasmin or Nadia followed, but when we reached my doors, Mother Feathergala stood outside, her shoulders shaking as she wept, a kerchief held to her mouth and covering her cries. I pulled her to me, wrapping my arms around her shoulders and shushing her as she clung to me and sobbed. Guards rushed in and out, so many words flying I couldn't make sense of what was happening. When my attendant had finally quieted enough, I pulled back from her. "Mother Feathergala," I asked, looking into her red-rimmed eyes. "What has happened?" She wailed. "Jemisin." A jolt startled me straight, and I peered into the room where everyone huddled. Nadia arrived at my side. To her, I asked, "Can you see to her?" As soon as Nadia had nodded and taken Mother Feathergala in her arms, I pushed past the guards into the room, clearing my throat and standing as tall as possible. My chambers were sizable, but at the entry and toward the attendant area of the suite, the quarters were more cramped and certainly wouldn't hold dozens of armed guards. I took a deep breath and from my gut bellowed, "Clear a path!" The guards molded themselves to the walls on either side, bowing their heads slightly as I held my chin high and passed by. At the end of the hall, I peered into the kitchen. I balled my hands into fists at my side to keep them still, as I saw Jessa's twisted body on the floor, a tray of dishware and food splattered across the floor, and her once warm eyes staring coldly into space. Thalaja stood on the far side, and as soon as he caught sight of me, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. He swore under his breath and circled the body in my direction. "Who let her through?" When he reached me, I clung to him, all the while keeping my eyes on Jessa and trying to make sense of the scene before me, as he pulled at my shoulders, urging me from the room. "Mairynne," he whispered in my ear, "I'm very sorry. We'll take care of this. You need not worry." I pulled away, swung back with my fist, and pounded it onto his chest. How dare you believe I wouldn't worry about this? She was my oldest friend, and she's dead. In my rooms. And we have emptied Arashi's guards to come and see to the matter? Couldn't you have handled this more discreetly? He looked away then, as 2 guards appeared at the end of my soldier-lined hallway, carrying a litter. Perrine was at their backs. The healer, Senti Samargala, is preparing space, sir, he said to the Lhasa. My first guard nodded and waved the 2 with the litter through. The rest of you, return to your posts. He pulled me to the side so the litter could pass. We'll take her to the House of Healing. Mayhap Senti Samargala can determine what has happened. The guards left, a murmur rising as they made their way out of my chambers and away. My eyes prickled then, a sense of small relief settling over me. Confidence that the Lhasa and the healer would get the situation under control and provide answers. Who did this? I whispered. There is no evidence that anyone is responsible. I clung to him, and he held me gently, both of us heedless of the watching guards. I assumed the impropriety seemed appropriate, given the matter at hand. The Lhasa continued. Jessa's mother states she left her alone in your rooms where she was preparing a midday meal for you. When the elder Feathergala returned, she found her daughter as you saw her now. She ran to the guards posted at the keep's entrance, who sent word to me. I have only arrived in the last few moments myself. No one has moved her until now. The extra guards cleared out, and one of the 2 who had brought the litter poked his head out from the kitchen. My lady, maybe use your blanket? I'll get it, a strained voice called from the door. Mother Feathergala scurried into the room, wiping the tears from under her eyes. I went to her and grasped her arms, turning her to me. You just found your daughter. You should take some time. Nadia had followed her inside, and I waved her over. Mother Feathergall, you do not have to tend to me in your own time of need. We will find another. Her lip quivered. No, Lady Mairynne. You and your sisters are as much daughters to me as my own Jemisin. She covered her mouth with a fist and paused. A minute or more passed, but when recovered, she continued. And I'd worry about you the entire time. I cannot promise I'll not weep from time to time, but please, allow me this. Caring for you and your rooms is all I know. My family gathered at the Pyre Fields. The day before, intricate mandalas of brightly colored sand had covered the ground, designs meant to offer my mother up to the gods so they would guide her safely to her next life. In the natural course of death, the bodies of emperors, empresses, and clergy would be entombed, so that while their corporeal presence remained on land, their souls were freed to pass into the heavens and find their eternal homes aside Atun, Otar, and Selene. Since Kogo Noraline had been murdered, the teachings of Atun dictated that she should be offered another life via a grand fire. In the ceremony following the pyre, my mother's ashes had been blended with colorful sands, which the acolytes of our holy triad shaped into intricate sacred mandalas across the scorched land. Yesterday, when my dear friend Jessa had left this life, and we transported her body to the healer, in hopes he'd discover the cause of her death, the acolytes had swept my mother's sands. On this day, we gathered for the giving of the sands. Jessa would receive little of this ceremony, only a simple pyre to see her to the next life. I turned from the field, closing my eyes, fighting tears, and now believing she and my mother had been far more fortunate than father. If he had indeed met his death and hadn't received the rites of mourning through entombment or pyre, he would never meet Atun. He wouldn't walk with Otar and Selene into his next life, and his soul would never shine in the night sky. If I accepted his disappearance without the offering of his body through funeral rites, his soul would forever wander the land, lost. The tragedy of my father's fate twisted my belly. And though I felt within the deepest part of me he still lived, the solution to finding him eluded me. Today, our people, my people, would come to receive the holy sands so they might take home a piece of their empress. My sisters, Nadia and I, would greet each person in turn and hand them a file. Where they would keep these sands within their homes, I did not know. But our traditions dictated that every one of her subjects had a right to own a token of remembrance of their ruler, my mother. Along the north side of the square field, I walked the length of the platform, past thousands of tiny glass vials, corked and arranged in neat rows, to meet my sisters. Though Otar had only risen a quarter of the way into the sky, a trickle of sweat rolled down my back. Carine opened her arms to me as I approached, and I hugged her. She whispered in my ear, "I heard of your loss. 'Tis difficult, I'm sure, to be here today. May Selene heal your heart, sister." "Thank you," I said simply, then hugged Yasmin, then Nadia. Imrizel and Nestrine were also on the podium as my sister's first advisors. My aunt, not believing herself royalty, had not named a first advisor. Instead, her partner, Corwine Donsgal, stood at her side, offering a warm smile. Much to Carine's dismay, I'd arrived alone. "After today, you must choose an advisor, Mairynne," commanded Carine, Imrizel at her side and Nestrine at Yasmin's. Standing straight and holding my ground, I replied, "Today, of all days, is not the day to worry over first advisors. I have also chosen to defer selection of advisors for my council for a time. Do you wish to judge me in that matter as well?" I caught a green light, a glint from Imrizel's hard stare, and locked gazes with her one unveiled eye. Yasmin furrowed her brows. "I thought you would have selected Jessa." "Jessa was a loyal friend indeed," I replied, my throat tightening as I held contact with Carine's named advisor. I swallowed and asked, "Imrizel, is there aught you wish to say?" She smiled, and though it seemed in deference, something told me otherwise. Her head slightly tilted, she said, "It is only that the Sandiscals have not been a part of the royal council in the past. We are anxious to serve the Serpentine Throne, Lady Mairynne." "I see," but her words felt contrived. "And would you suggest I select someone from your family from the great sands near Yoti? A storm sorcerer whom I have never met, mayhap?" The bells began to ring, snipping the conversation, and any reply she might offer short. The acolytes of the citadel, servants to Atun, Otar, and Selene alike, opened the gates into the pyre fields. Reluctantly, I turned my attention. People, thousands of people dressed in mourning robes, waited in the streets beyond and began to filter inside from the east. They walked the perimeter along the south, then the west, many stopping at some point to call a tiny gust of wind into a handful of rose petals. The winds showered the petals onto the clean-swept pyre field and represented the people's gifts and well wishes to the fallen in her next life. Others knelt and dropped packages at the edges of the field, an action marking them as either casteless or of a lesser caste who had no powers to call forth and shower petals over where my mother had burned. After their offerings, each storm sorcerer walked the northern side and received his or her file from one of the family, before returning to the eastern gates. Tradition restricted the casteless and lower castes from standing upon the family's podium, so they accepted a file from one of the clergy members instead. A pause in the steady stream of people came after some time, and Imrizel took the opportunity to further her case. "Your father, Tenyo Azarine, only selected from the families at Storm's Keep. I'd beg you to consider those from outside the city's walls. If not as your first advisor, at least for one to sit on your private council." I held my tongue, not wanting to mar the sanctity of one of our most sacred rituals. Carine supported her advisor. "Expanding your council to include more of the Nantai people would be Mother's wish, do you not agree? I glared at my sister, but forced a smile as the next group of people approached. Retrieving a handful of files from the table, I distributed them. An older man, stooped and limping, came forward and accepted the last file in my hand. He then offered me his own hand to shake. When I accepted, his skin felt paper-thin, but the strength with which he gripped perpetuated the dichotomy, and his eyes held a youth at odds with his bent posture. They were dark gray, and within his right pupil was a white fleck, a malformation of sorts. He smiled warmly, and I felt that the heavy robes and my sweating under Otar's gaze were a price well paid. "May Attune watch over you, kind sir," I said, attempting to bring myself back to center. His voice hale and an octave higher than I would have imagined, and somewhat forced through his nose, he replied, "Many, many thanks, Lady Mairynne Evangale. May Otar fill your days with joy, Selene guard your soul under her silvery light, and Attune care for your path to the Serpentine Throne." As he went, I watched him limp away for long minutes until he had passed through the gates and out of sight. My brow felt heavy, and I chewed the inside of my lip as I puzzled over the person. "Mairynne?" Careen recalled my attention. I swung my head around and snapped, "What would you have of me, sister? Things are simply too difficult to make rash decisions at the moment. Would you also advise that I include a northern gull, an island gull from the Vester Isles? Any of our brethren from southern Nantai?" The others in my family looked on surreptitiously as I debated with my eldest sister and Imrizel, but they continued to tend to their duties. Corwine, having retreated into the citadel, returned with water to quench our thirsts and stave off the heat for another hour, and the acolytes held off the people while we partook. Imrizel refused the offer, instead responding, "If that is the will of the future empress, we would find that an equal and appropriate measure." Her words stung, as if she were trying to manipulate me through deference. I answered, "Never before has an emperor or empress demanded one of our people leave their clan to sit in an advisory council. It is why we conduct the true business of the realm at the High Cloud Court in regular cycles. What makes us important enough to make demands that would separate families for longer periods?" I sighed, and more quietly said, "I am uncertain why I would begin such a tradition." "Sister," Careen admonished. Her defense of her first advisor rang true and steady when she continued more quietly, "Imrizel only means to include the more nomadic families." I raised my brows to her, offended that she'd stand by someone who didn't belong to our family on such a day, heavy in the heart that she wouldn't hold more compassion for all I'd just been through. My dismay came out as an accusation toward her, too. "Ah, so would you also recommend that we include a representative from the Sinti?" I had grown weary of the conversation, and my words were shorter than necessary, intended to stop her suggestions. I knew this wasn't her implication. The Sinti were nomads who lived apart from the people by choice. They were us, but not. They chose to eschew our traditions in favor of roaming the lands hidden under Sim. As my ire continued to build, I pressed my rebuttal harder. "And what of a cloud courtier? A frost fighter or a fire forger? Maybe a stone singer and an underhill dweller? And let us not forsake the small folk or the casteless." Heat kindled inside as I rattled off every group of our people that came to mind, until Nadia placed a hand on my arm. She rested the other on Careen's. "This is a conversation for another time." Lifting my chin, I spat. "It most certainly is. We should return to our people and the giving of the sands." Quieter, I added with chagrin, "Thank you, Aunt Nadia." "Mairynne," Careen started. I whirled on her, but felt intent on bringing the conversation to an end. "My dear sister, I have duly noted your requests, but our aunt speaks true. We are spoiling this rite for us and for our people. The rite of release will follow in a week's time. I have until the day after when I am to host an audience at the High Cloud Court to address such matters. Today, let us honor our traditions." My speech worked as desired and silenced the topic. From then on, we went about the rite in companionable silence, holding light and idle conversation throughout. Mother Feathergall, her eyes still swollen from her abundance of tears shed, brought a late afternoon meal for the family, and the Triad called a pause so we might dine. Later, as the sun began to set, the last of the people trickled through. Edamine approached when all had passed, to let us know that they were shutting the gates, and the acolytes would begin cleaning. Over the quieter course of the later hours, I'd thought more and more of the need to find my father. I turned to my eldest sister. "Carine, have you given thought to the party we'll send in search of father?" Both she and Yasmin gaped, eyes wide and jaws working, but failing to produce words. I hadn't expected otherwise, but like they both had their own agendas, I had need to pursue my own. "Carine, I've asked Yasmin to plan for the Ascension ceremonies. Whilst I am considering my advisory council and first advisor, I'd like you to take charge of this matter and put out a call for a party who will accept such a duty and search the lands for Tenyo Azarine." Carine closed her mouth and hesitated, then curtsied. I did believe I'd succeeded in shocking my eldest, most poised sister into submission, if only for a time. She bowed, then turned toward the citadel to make her exit. It was progress. Imarizel dipped her head and joined my sister. I turned to Nadia, who said, "You've recovered well, my niece." She chuckled as she looked after them. Then she took my arm and pulled me in the direction of the castle. Corwine walked at her side. As we went, she asked, "I may have missed him, but did the Lajah come through today?"